We often refer to animals making music with such terms as bird song, but in fact, music is a very human endeavor with a very complex structure. Today, we talk about the differences and, much more interestingly, the similarities between music and language. This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today's topic is language and music based on a listener suggestion. This is a topic that's been gaining popularity both in linguistics literature and literature and music theory. And really those two domains, people are starting to sort of bridge the gap between them and realize that the more that you generalize or formalize these two, what seem to be very separate domains, the more similarities you seem to find, although they are definitely still two different domains. So I'm going to go into that issue a little bit and give a general overview. I'm going to base a lot of my discussion today on an article, or rather a book chapter, entitled Alignment in Language and Music by John N. Williams. It's chapter 19 of a volume called Language and Music as Cognitive Systems, edited by Rebushat, Rohrmeyer, Hawkins, and Cross, available from Oxford University Press, and published very recently, in 2012, brand new book. So it's very interesting. I'd recommend reading it, and let me tell you about some of the issues that arise in it and some of the things that are discussed specifically in chapter 19, which is very short. It's only like 5 pages. But here's the basic issue. Now let's assume we have a situation where two people are talking to each other. The first concept I need to introduce is that of linguistic alignment. And this has been discussed in a lot of psycholinguistic literature. And it has to do with the fact that people will mimic others that they're talking to. So let's say there's a person A and a person B. Person A makes a statement, uses some, phonological style, perhaps has some accent, has certain word choices, so lexical decisions that they make in their statement. Person B will then be influenced by all of these different items that person A has thrown out there. So, for example, if you use the word road instead of street, and person B needs to use a word referring to a road or a street, and person A has already used road, then person B will be more likely to use road. This is very, very closely related to the concept of priming, right? So in priming, you can prepare people to respond a certain way to a question based on cues that you give them. So if you pick out a domain of animals, for example, you prime them for animals and you ask them to think of something at random, they're more likely to think of an animal than something out of a previous context. This is what's known as alignment. So when two conversational partners are talking to each other, they will sort of mimic each other. They'll prime each other in different ways, and eventually, different subdomains or different levels of linguistic structure will become aligned to each other. So this occurs very frequently at the lexical level. Right, so the word choice of person A will affect person B, and then the word choice of person B will affect person A, and vice versa. And 10 minutes into the conversation, you're using the same words to refer to different things. It'll also occur at the phonetic level. It'll even occur at the level of meaning, at least in theory, because the longer you two talk to each other, the more likely you are to be, quote unquote, on the same page. Right, you're going to be more likely to understand each other if you've been talking to each other for a while. Likewise, if you encounter someone with a heavy accent, you start talking to them, you talk back, eventually you reach a point where you can understand each other very well. You're not necessarily mimicking each other. In other words, you're not going to lose or gain any accent, but you are prepared to hear that accent. You're expecting the accent of one person or the other, and therefore you have fewer times when you don't understand that person. All right, so this is all related to this concept of alignment. Different levels of linguistic analysis will be aligned to each other between two conversational partners. And it's very interesting in linguistics because we have all these different levels of linguistic analysis that we can go into, right? So we can say that, at the lexical level, they have alignment. They have alignment at the phonological level. They have alignment at the semantic level. Perhaps there's even syntactic decisions, which can influence one another, and therefore they're aligned at the syntactic level, right? So you can sort of break it down into all these different levels of analysis, and say that when you're watching two conversational partners, you can mark down different decisions that are being made, different ways that they prime each other, and probabilities for what each one will produce is based on what they have comprehended from their partner. Okay. Now, the article concerns the same kind of issue, but with music. So the first point that is made is that really in music, you can end up with a similar kind of alignment phenomenon. So if you're listening to music and you hear a musical melody that evokes a feeling of sadness in you, so perhaps there's something in a minor key in music, which is the key that is supposed to kind of evoke this sad sort of feeling, or even a depressed sort of feeling of longing or something like that. If you feel that way, and assuming that the composer of the musical piece composed that piece because that was the message he wanted to get across, then what you have done, in a sense, well, really you've done two things. One, you have communicated successfully, specifically the composer to the listener has communicated a meaning, but at a more formal level, that level of analysis, the semantic level, the meaning behind what was composed, has been aligned. In other words, now the listener and the composer are working from the same page. They have the same subdomain of thoughts that are being read from. So if the composer now changes to a major key and gets happy, the sort of juxtaposition of those two will not go unnoticed by the listener, i.e. the listener is starting from the same point as the composer after that feeling has been conveyed. Okay, so this is very similar to an idea of alignment. We have a conversational partner, if you will, A, influencing partner B, influencing the feelings that partner B is having, influencing the thoughts, the decisions that partner B will make. Now, of course, there is a crucial difference that needs to be brought in very early on, and that is that partner B is not really a partner when listening to music, at least not in this particular example. So partner B has no way to then respond to the composer with his own musical melody and match what the composer has done or be influenced by the composer in that way. So there is no production component to the listener. However, there is still a transference of information from partner A to partner B, and in that sense they're very similar, at least at the level of semantics. So the meaning has been conveyed. Now, what other levels are there of music? Well, in fact, you have many different structural levels of analysis in music. So you do have things like, key, you have things like time, signature. All of these are structural components of a musical composition. And they, too, are all passed implicitly to a listener. So if a song is, in the key of G and, there's an F thrown in there instead of an F sharp, that effect, it can be done. It's sometimes called an accidental. It can be done, but it is technically out of the key of G. And so it will have a certain strange kind of sound. And the composer can put a note like that in the composition to evoke a strange feeling. And that strange feeling will be felt by the listener, regardless of whether or not they are knowledgeable in music structure or not. This is one of the strange things about music, is that as a cognitive process, it has a lot of things going on that are sort of under the hood that you don't need to know about. So that F note will sound weird to someone even if they don't know that it's an F note, and even if they don't know that F is not in the key of G. So these are all kind of interesting points to make. Now, what's the bigger picture? Well, if we go and we try and make the situation more analogous, it really becomes a lot more interesting. So we've already said that when you have a composer and a listener, the listener has no recourse to go back and repeat something or to be influenced by what the composer has done. Let's imagine we have a jazz band. And, we have a saxophone player and a pianist. And the pianist does a nice solo in some song that the jazz band is playing, and now it's the turn of the saxophonist to play a solo. It's not uncommon to hear melodic elements from one soloist show up in the other soloist. Now the question is, would those elements have showed up if the first soloist hadn't played them? So imagine a certain melodic line that the pianist plays. It shows up in some of what the saxophonist ends up playing in his solo. Now this is very interesting because this is similar on a different level, right? We have a level of melody now in the music. Not just a level of key or a time signature, but a level of melody that is being repeated from one instrument to another, one player to another. Now we do have a real conversation going on between the pianist and the saxophonist, and they're bouncing things off of each other. That's a crucial element, really, of jazz musicianship, is that these players do this, and people enjoy hearing it. They enjoy hearing, things bounced off of each other. But the argument that could be made is that this is a very natural kind of process. Why? Because we do the same thing in linguistic communication, right? We have this idea of alignment. Two people in a conversation, they align to each other at different levels of analysis. And in music, at least in that particular situation, we seem to see very much the same kind of thing going on. Okay? So what does this mean? We can analogize and we can say, yeah, these things seem similar, but do we really have two similar issues at play here? The whole idea, the grand scheme idea, if you will, the big picture, is that you can assume that language is a cognitive process. It is something that is shaped by the hardware it runs on, right? If you want to look at it as hardware and software, to analogize even further, language would be the software, the brain is the hardware, right? Every language runs on the same hardware. And on that same hardware runs music. And music runs, it has the same kind of restrictions in terms of processing, has the same kind of production restrictions, same comprehension restrictions. So we would expect that there will be some shared structure, as we would expect with any cognitive process. And I should mention that music and language are not the only two things that have been noted or hypothesized to be related in this way. In other words, to be two similar cognitive processes. Even things like mathematics have been suggested to be related in some way to language or to music. All these things, anything that is closely related to cognition, that is closely related to, processes that you don't necessarily think about, sort of natural responses to things. Mathematics certainly is less so than something like music, but still there are some aspects of mathematics which people have argued are very natural. Anything like that, any of these natural processes, people say perhaps they're related. And in recent years, we've seen a lot of work that has tried to sort of quantify these relationships. And this book is no different. So the I'm so used to saying article. The book chapter that I referenced in the beginning of this episode just covers alignment. And it talks about alignment in music and language, basically what I've just talked about, which really is food for thought. And at this point in the game, I think that most would agree with me that a lot of the work that's been done, a lot of the literature available on this stuff, is still at kind of the food for thought level. This is something that hasn't been looked at in as much detail as other things, obviously. However, to me, it's incredibly interesting. To a certain listener, it was incredibly interesting, and so I hope that this introduction has been interesting to you guys. So just think about these things. Next time you're listening to a song, what kind of feelings have been passed along to you by the composer of that song? Another issue that comes to mind with this kind of thing, and that is actually mentioned in the book chapter, is that there is a certain difference, but then again, perhaps a certain similarity between language and music that is very specific, and that is that in language we have certain language varieties that are looked upon as higher or higher order than some other varieties, right? So we have social stigmas that surround certain language varieties. And likewise, we have social stigmas that surround certain musical varieties. So if you're listening to pop versus if you're listening to classical, you have different expectations that you place upon the composition. And another point that that John Williams makes in the chapter is that you're more likely to respond in a very specific way the more complex the music is, i.e. the more complex the composition. So if you're listening to classical and you're paying attention to it, you are more likely to evoke a more complex response to that than you are to pop music. Now, that is a claim that he makes. I don't know if it's true, but again, at the food for thought level, it's very interesting, right? Because when someone is talking to you, it's considered rude not to listen to them if they're speaking to you. But it's not considered rude to sort of zone out to your classical music. So at some level there, you can choose the amount of affect given to you by the music. And that level that you choose will likely be different based on the type of music. So are you more or less likely to pay attention to classical than you are to pay attention to pop? It depends. The issue is further muddied by the fact that pop music often has lyrics and classical often does not. And if you're mixing a linguistic element with a musical element, then certainly that's going to change the equation, right? Are you more likely to pay more attention to pop music then because it has words in it? Who knows? So my final point, and this is not mentioned in the article, but I'm sure it's mentioned somewhere in the book. All this being food for thought, take it with a grain of salt. However, it is very interesting that two different domains, which supposedly are related, often cross into each other even before this type of thing was studied. Lyrics have been sung to melody forever. And it's very interesting that that occurs across all cultures. Any human culture has lyric sung to melody. And just from that alone, we should expect something shared between music and language. We should expect that they share some kind of underpinning, even without looking at anything else, without trying to formalize anything. The fact that they often show up together, I think, in itself is very interesting. So, thank you for listening to this, episode 26. Once again, that book is Language and Music as Cognitive Systems, edited by Rebouchat, Romeyer, Hawkins, and Cross, 2012, Oxford University Press. If you have any questions or comments, please send me a line on Twitter at LinguistChris. That is the best way to get in contact with you, even though it's kind of a short message system, right? You're limited to 140 characters per tweet. So obviously, if your question is simpler, that's better. But I am quicker to respond to Twitter than I am to email. I think just because emails typically are a little bit longer. So don't be discouraged, right? If you send me an email and it's a lengthier question, I will get back to you. I do really try and make a point to get back to everybody who emails me. But if you just have a quick suggestion, please do it via Twitter, because other people can also see your suggestion and can comment on that and say, I'm really interested in topic X as well. That would be really good. And then I'll kind of bump it up in my list, right? Because I've got at least, 2 listeners that are interested in that. So keep all that stuff in mind when contacting me, and please do. I really do enjoy hearing from listeners and hearing all your helpful suggestions and or critiques. That's also helpful as well. So with that, I will thank you one more time for listening, and hopefully you guys will hear me next time.